Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, the Friday podcast about your Kindle books and all things Amazon. I'm Len Edgerly. Today is the Ides of March. That's the 15th day of the month, 2019. Greetings from Austin, Texas. I have been attending South by Southwest most of this week. I've also been doing some projects with my cousin Peter Ty. I'm staying with him, and he's about to make a big transition into a senior community here in Austin. So we've done some of that. I bounced back and forth from stimulating tech sessions, particularly some appearance by presidential candidates, a little tour on a CNN town hall. This has been a very full week of multi-dimensional activity, all of it pretty stimulating. And I've managed to get enough sleep, too. So I'm going to organize the show around a single topic. This is something which I picked up at one of the sessions I'm going to be telling you about, and the topic is trust. And what we will see is that you can increase the trustworthiness of your activities with some 3 tips from a speaker that I heard. And we'll talk about those. You'll hear some excerpts from that particular talk. And I'm going to loop everything into consideration of trust as a way to navigate through some of the experiences that had the most impact on me here at South by Southwest. Let's have a little music and then we'll just jump right in.
Good morning, everybody. Trust is complicated.
That is Neil Pasricha in Ballroom D at the Austin Convention Center. That's one of the biggest venues, seats hundreds of people. And his was a featured session titled Building Trust in Distrustful Times. He is the author of the Book of Awesome, and he runs a website about happiness. I hadn't heard of this fellow before. I walked into Ballroom D kind of on a whim. I thought I would just wander up toward Ballroom D and see who was there, and trust is something that sounded interesting enough to sit down. I was glad I did. This is what he had to say at the intro, and then we're going to drill a little deeper.
It is nuanced, it is layered, it is multifaceted, it is mysterious, it is this gigantic, nebulous, important thing. And it's so critical for all of us, whether we are an artist, whether we are a brand, whether we are a company, an individual, a member of a family, a member of a nonprofit. It's critical for all of us to know how to manage and grow trust. But we live in an era with the lowest levels of trust ever recorded in decades.
I think you've heard enough to catch that this is an animated speaker who was very easy to listen to. He was also a very well-organized speaker. He had distilled his thoughts about this big topic of trust into 3 points, and he went through them 1, 2, 3, and at the end he had a circle where all 3 of them were displayed, and he let it stay up there on the slides long enough so everybody could take pictures of it with their iPhones so they'd be able to remember it. The 3 points are: first, finite over infinite; second, human over algorithm; and 3, go all in, show all in. Since we are going to be spending some time with Neil's ideas, let's give him a chance to introduce himself properly.
My name is Neil Pasricha. I am the author of a number of books, all focused on intentional living. My first book is called The Book of Awesome, which is all about gratitude. My most recent book is called The Happiness Equation, which is all about happiness. The book I have coming out this fall is all about failure and resilience. And the book I'm working on today is all about trust. So let's crack in to 3 ways that we can all learn how to build more trust today.
If I had to pick just one of Neil's 3 points to carry with me, I think it would be this first one, finite over infinite. He said several times, in an era of infinite choice, the value of curation skyrockets. This is instantly understandable to me when I am in front of my computer at any time during the day, like when I'm trying to work on the podcast and really get focused. This flow of information, of options, of music, of entertainment, of ideas, it's truly endless. It's truly infinite. And so places where I can have a curated look at material. This is why I value a subscription to the Washington Post or the New York Times. My problem is I have too many subscriptions. But when I go into one of those established newspapers, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, I'm getting a curated look that has certain perspectives that I understand and trust and value, at this infinite amount of news, and that value just gets very high. Neil has used this idea to talk about the 1,000 most formative books. He's going through 3 books in a show on his podcast, and he's really made kind of a specialty of finding things that he takes a lot of time choosing and then putting his choices in front of his audience in ways which I'm sure he's got all kinds of followers, and the value of it is obvious to me. One example that he had is fits our area of interest here, and it's about the why independent bookstores are doing so well in the age of Amazon.
And maybe why over the last 6 years, during what we call the retail apocalypse here in the States, when Amazon took over the book industry and they have 200 million books and they're always the cheapest, why over that exact same 6-year stretch, the number of independent, curated, finite bookstores spiked by 40%. Props to independent bookstores for anyone in the room that's a fan like me.
Me too. Who doesn't like independent bookstores? Tattered Cover in Denver being one of my favorite examples. Props also to Amazon because it is also seeing the value of curation. We've, from time to time, had people from the Amazon Books team. Their whole job is to find the best books and to talk about them and to highlight them on the Amazon Book Review blog. And now they have a podcast as well. There's a real value to be highlighting books right in the middle of all of those millions of books. I don't think it's quite 100 million books. That was a bit of an exaggeration, but certainly lots of books available at Amazon. One of the reasons I love to go to South by Southwest each year is to find ideas and then actually use them. And as I was listening to Neil talk about finite over infinite, I was thinking of the Kindle Chronicles podcast. I think it's one of the reasons that it has been a good idea for most of these years to finish the show at right about 45 minutes. It used to be 45, 58. I've given myself a little slack on that. But to know that when you start the show, it's going to last 45 minutes, and then it's going to be done. There isn't going to be another one until next Friday. So it's a finite amount of material about a finite number of topics, namely Kindle, books, and Amazon. The clarity of Neil's first point makes me think that within those topics, it builds trust with you when I'm talking to pick the things that are most interesting to talk about. I used to pull my hair out as I was looking at 5 or 10 stories about Amazon in a week and think that I had to get them all in and be kind of comprehensive on those topics. But lately, and I think I would be even more doing this as a result of his talk, find the thing that I really want to talk about that tickles me in some kind of a way or bothers me, and then go there and have a curated way of talking about the general topics. So finite over infinite. Here's what's next.
Number 2. Human over algorithm.
He started this topic off with a cute story about being in bed with his wife, going to bed early one night when the kids were asleep. And the next day, after they'd had a night together, she says, "You sent me an email at 10 o'clock last night." He said, "No, I was asleep next to you. That's impossible." Turns out he had, I think, set up MailChimp to send out emails about his blog or his podcast or something. Since she has subscribed to him, she got one of the emails because of an algorithm. And it really irritated her because she thought that he was sending these posts out to her and the rest of his subscribers manually, that he writes a post and then he hits the button. When she found out it was an algorithm that was sending her husband's material to her, it just went down in her esteem. She didn't trust it as much. So it was a clever way to introduce the topic. This second point of his actually made me feel better because I've always thought, gee, I should be using algorithms. I should be sending tweets out after an episode and having some program do it for me, or the MailChimp letters to those of you who subscribe to the Kindle Chronicles newsletter. I do everything manually. When I finish the show, I write that letter to MailChimp and then I send it out myself, and I'm going to keep doing that. So if you get something from me, you can be pretty sure that I hit the send button myself. It wasn't an algorithm. An alternate way of stating the second point, humans over algorithms, was brains over bots. And to illustrate that, he told the story of Vish, the best Uber driver in the universe.
I saw something that night as I was leaving the bar that I had never seen before in my life, and I have never seen since. And it was this. a guy named Vish was picking me up with a 4.99 rating and almost 5,000 rides. So I looked at everyone around me at the bar. I'm like, I'm about to get a drive home from the world's greatest Uber driver. People start high-fiving me, right? Like, you guys know what it's like down on College Street, people in the front. I'm like, people are high-fiving me, right? I go outside, I'm excited. I'm like, this is going to be so interesting. Like, what's going to be? Like, is it like, Cristal in the back? What's up? So I open the door, and forgive the Indian accent. I grew up hearing it in my house and everywhere. It's the only accent I will ever attempt, okay? But I open the door, he looks me in the eye, he turns around, he's like, is it Neil? Is it Neil? I'm like, it is Neil. It is Neil. I get in the backseat of the car. We have this great conversation on the way home. He's funny. He's smiling. He's got a great personality, as you would expect, based on the rating. And as we get close to my house, I said, you know what, Vish? You might actually be the world's greatest Uber driver. I take Uber all the time. I've never seen a rating close to you. He's like, is it true? Is it true? I said, I don't know if it's true. He's like, there's no leaderboard. There's no way to check. He's like, all I can see is the last 500 ratings I've got. It's like, really? Can you show me? He's like, yeah, here it is.
Here a slide shows up on the screen showing nothing but 5.0 ratings for Vish.
That's an actual screenshot. He has 500 straight. I'm like, no one's better than you. How could they be? In an era of bots, we want brains. Maybe handshakes and smiles are what are actually becoming the scarcest resources of all.
Applying this point to the Kindle Chronicles isn't quite as direct as the first. I don't use many algorithms. I do put the podcast out on Libsyn. It goes all over the world on the internet. There's some sort of automated things that happen. But one thing that has been more and more important to me over the years of doing the show is having a chance to connect with people in person. And as an example, here in Austin, when I come down, I drove for an hour and a half to have lunch with Mark Roberts, a listener from the Dallas area, and we always have a great time. We talked about politics and lots of other things. And then I drove an hour and a half back to Austin. I get emails from him. We stay in touch, but there's nothing like sitting across a table from someone and he says, you might try the deep fried pickles, which I did, and they were great. It's the same with Catherine Malm, a listener here in Austin. I've met with several times when I've been at South by. Each time, we don't stay in touch much in the intervening year, but because of shared interest, the fact she listens to the show and we know each other, very intriguing lunch. This one went kind of deep. We ended up talking about her husband died and now she's engaged to be remarried. We talked about marriage. We talked about all kinds of things that were fascinating. And she took a picture of me riding one of the scooters down the sidewalk, which I greatly appreciated. Emails, ways to touch listeners and hear from listeners. It's always worth the effort to make some kind of a human connection, even with something that's being distributed electronically like a podcast.
Now it's time for our third and final point. And this one is, go all in, show all in.
I think I've intuitively known the value of focusing on a topic right from the start of this show 10 years ago, focusing on the Kindle, and now settling into the Kindle books and all things Amazon. Actually, as I listened to this part of Neil's talk, I thought, well, I've got sort of three foci on this show, and maybe I should pare it down to two. Maybe this should just be about the Kindle and books, or just books and Amazon. And I couldn't find one that I would willingly drop off. So I think I'm pretty settled with the idea that I'm going all in on these three topics, all in the sense that it's all I talk about each week, and it's what I've talked about for 10 years. So this growing time of spending on the topic is how I'm interpreting the go all in, show all in. As you'd expect, he had a good story to illustrate this third and last point about trust.
I'm walking around Toronto one day. There's a neighborhood just to the west of the downtown core called Parkdale. For those that may know Toronto, this is a kind of a grittier neighborhood, gentrifying neighborhood. I'm walking past kind of like the dollar stores, money marts, and I stumble upon this place called Craig's Cookies. Right? Great neighborhood, artistic neighborhood, but I'm like, Craig's Cookies? What's this, a bright yellow building? No way, it just sells cookies? I walk into the store, sure enough, this is the display.
We're now looking at a photograph of what's in the displays at the store.
There's no brownies. There's no tarts. There's no croissants. There's no pies. It's just cookies. A guy looks me in the eye. I presume he's Craig. He looks at me. He says, "Is it cookie time?" What are you going to say? Or I'm like, hell yeah, it's cookie time. 2 chocolate chips. So I ordered 2 cookies. He says, "Hi, I'm Craig. Thanks for coming to my store." He's like, here's your chocolate chip cookies. And so I get the chocolate chip cookies. He looks me in the eye and he's like, "You want a shot of cold milk?" They only have 1 drink there. You can kind of see it in the background. It's just cold milk. That's it. All they sell is cookies and cold milk. So I leave this place and I'm like, wow, good luck to that guy. Like, how are you going to pay downtown Toronto rents by selling just chocolate chip cookies for $3 a pop? I'm like, I give this guy like a month, But I'm such a nice guy. I'm super nice to. I'm gonna send them a couple bulk orders. I'm gonna send a couple gift bag orders for the store. I'm trying to keep them afloat. So I do that, and I go back 6 months later. There's a different. First of all, it's open. Second of all, there's a guy behind the counter. It's not Craig. And I sort of come in. I'm like, "Hey, you guys are here." I'm like, "This is great." I'm like, "Congratulations." He's like, "What? What are you talking about?" I'm like, "I'm Neil. I'm the guy that's been sending you the bulk orders for once in a while." He's like, "I no idea who I am." I'm like, "I want a pat on the back and want thank you for helping us pay the rent." He's like, "Dude, we do dozens of orders a day. I don't know how to keep track of them all." I'm like, "Dozens a day?" He's like, "Yeah, we're up at Nordstrom right now. We're selling 90 dozen a day before lunch. They invited us up rent-free. They just want the smell of chocolate chip cookies in their store." I'm like, "You're selling 90 dozen a day, just that one store that you're not even paying rent for?" He's like, "Yeah. Go all in."
So, is it Kindle time? We're going to return to Neil in the conclusion of his talk, but I want to use the topic of trust to segue to another unusual aspect of South by Southwest this year, and that was a lineup of presidential candidates and people kind of involved in presidential politics on both sides of the aisle, more on the Democratic side than the Republican. But this was at a nice, intimate theater where Austin City Lights, I believe, is filmed, and over the first 2 days, this was on the first weekend, we heard from Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, Bill Weld, former governor from Massachusetts, who said that he's toying with running as a Republican challenger to President Trump, Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, former Governor John Hickenlooper from Colorado, who I've been very interested in and supporting, John Kasich, former governor of Ohio, who surprised people, I think, by saying that he has not ruled out running himself, former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Julian Castro, and Mayor Pete Buttigieg. He's mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And then a late addition was Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State, who had just announced about a week before this all happened. In addition, there were 2 candidates that appeared that night at a CNN town hall, and also Pete Buttigieg was there. Quite a line. Bernie Sanders wasn't there. Joe Biden was there. They had tried to get both of them to come. If there was a way to evaluate how all of these candidates did, along with Kevin McCarthy, who is Republican House Minority Leader, trust. Many of them are specifically addressing the divisiveness in the country and offering their solution to it, which involves voting for them. But as I was watching all of these sessions, and I hadn't yet heard Neil's talk, but when I think back on who had the most impact on me, who seemed to resonate with the audience, I think trust would be an example. And I think you could probably go through the 3 elements that Neil's talking about as a way to evaluate who's using these various tools to increase their trust level. I'll give you an example of how an evaluation by trust level might work on one of the candidates. But first, let's listen to an interview I did about 2/3 of the way through the list of candidates with Evan Smith, who's head of the Texas Tribune, talking about how he came to organize this event at South by Southwest.
Our criteria was either be a declared candidate or somebody who is plausibly looking at the race. So in the case of Governor Kasich, who was here yesterday, Saturday, as we stand here talking on Sunday morning. He's not in the race. He said yesterday, copped to the fact that he's considering it, which is a surprise to no one. Ultimately may not run. So it was not you didn't have to be in, you just had to be looking at it. When we talked to Hickenlooper originally, and we didn't know that he would be in by the time of South by Southwest. We thought he might be considering it, and we actually had a sense that he was going to get in. But in the case of Governor Inslee, who kicks us off this morning as we stand here again Sunday morning, he wasn't even in the race until March 1st, which is about 8-9 days ago, and we called that morning and had him committed by the afternoon.
An unusual aspect of the format was that each candidate had an hour with one interviewer, and they were varied folks from Time Magazine, different publications, generally young, edgy, diverse interviewers who did a good job. I'm always interested in interviews, and I was asking Evan what was sort of the thinking on these interviews.
I think as an interviewer, you run toward the ball. It's a little bit like in sports, right? You run toward the ball, not away from it. And I think in the case of these interviewees, the ball is visible. You run toward the ball.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm from Denver. I'm interested in Hickenlooper. Where was the ball when you assigned his interviewer?
Well, I've known Governor Hickenlooper weirdly personally for a while. His first wife was a very old friend of mine for 30 years, and I went to his wedding. Strangely enough, she was writing for Texas Monthly, the magazine that I edited. So we were colleagues. I was her boss in those years. He's been to our festival a couple different times. I think Governor Hickenlooper is a really interesting guy because as the governor of a state like Colorado, he's dealt with almost every issue that a chief executive of sorts can deal with. I mean, he's not alone in that. Governor Inslee in a similar sense. Governor Kasich when he was running Ohio, same. The set of experiences that a governor has is different than the set of experiences a senator has. It's chief executive model versus legislator model. He's also temperamentally a little bit more small M moderate than other people, and I think his background as a small business person probably gives him a different perspective.
Here's another excerpt of my conversation with Evan in which he's talking about the venue. It was a wonderfully lit and arranged venue, amphitheater style. It could flex up to 2,000 people, but on the lower level where a lot of the people a lot of the candidates just filled the lower level, and it was a good place to sit in and feel like you were overhearing a fairly intimate conversation. He puts it this way.
There's an intimacy to an environment like this. I mean, we're in a very large venue, and again, over the course of the day, there were more people or fewer people, depending upon who the interviewee was, but it's a pretty intimate room. And how people being interviewed at that level react in a situation like this in the moment is telling.
Yeah.
That's why I think the power of public conversation is undeniable. You put somebody on a stage in front of a room full of people, you ask them hard questions, and you see how they react, and I think that's a good measure of whether they're up for the job.
Let's go back to Ballroom D, because after having heard the candidates in that intimate setting, when Neil was giving his talk about trust, I wanted to know if he would have any advice for a candidate who was trying to develop trust and thinking of the methodology that he's developed and shared with us. Here's how I was kind of a crush of people up there at the stage after his talk and just got this brief snippet from him.
Do you have any sense of what it means to build trust if you're running for office?
You can't be everything to everyone. The instinct in politics is to try to be this gigantic, wide, average candidate that appeals to a mass audience. No, you gotta be you. Ask yourself deep in your heart, deep in your value system, what are the things I stand for? Declare those things. Write them down. Post them on the website. Make them unmovable, unchangeable, unmatchable. And then let the people decide. If they don't want you, that's fine. But let it be because of your values. If you lose on your values, you lose with honor. If you win on your values, you win everything.
Good advice. And when it comes to trust, and I was thinking about this, about the candidates, I thought the fellow from Colorado did a good job generating trust because he was speaking so humanly, definitely not an algorithm, in touch with the most human emotions. When he was talking about the difficulties of being in the restaurant business and being in politics, when he has a condition called face blindness, and this is where the brain is simply not wired to retain information about the configuration of a face to the point where he can recognize people. I had a friend in college whose brother was in a terrible car accident on the Massachusetts Turnpike, and he had that same condition. And for years, we just learned that when we talked to Link, we had to tell him who we were, even as he was looking at us. And I was surprised to find out that John Hickenlooper has this same condition. He told an interesting aspect of it. He said that he had learned basically to hack this condition and still function in these very outward-facing professions. And in the restaurant business, he realized that if someone could tell that he didn't recognize them, they would be offended, especially if there was somebody that knew him very well. And so he would present to each person that came into his restaurant as if he knew them. And you couldn't overdo it, because if it was sort of strangely, oh, hey, how are you, Len? Then this, and they didn't know him, well, that would be odd. But he generated a sort of a default of looking forward to seeing every person, because he thought, well, some of these people I'm supposed to know, and the others that I don't know aren't going to mind being greeted in such a friendly way. And then his other condition is dyslexia, and he talked about that. So in this intimate setting of this theater, he put out some fairly personal information that I think probably had the effect of generating some trust. The one that did really well in that feature in the CNN town hall was the South Bend, Indiana mayor, Pete Buttigieg. And here's a clip where Jake Tapper is asking him, the topic is healthcare, and you'll have the tail end of that, and then it goes into something which got fairly personal, and I was kind of holding my breath, wondering, can this guy talk about this so recently after his loss? And for a 37-year-old young man, he did pretty well.
And it's become very personal for me, too, because we lost my father a few weeks ago. And it was to cancer. It was a brutally difficult time for our family. I make decisions for a living, and I was not prepared for some of the decisions that we faced in consultation with the medical team. But what I'll say is the decisions that we made only had to be about what was medically right for Dad and what was right for our family. We didn't have to think about whether our family would be financially ruined because of Medicare. And I want that to be available, that kind of security, that kind of freedom, frankly, to be available to every American.
I just want to take a moment, if you'll have a seat. I want to ask you about your father, Joseph. We're going to show the audience a picture of him. He was an English professor at Notre Dame. He passed away in January, just a few days after you announced you were exploring a presidential bid. We wanted to take a moment just to honor his memory, and also ask you, what did he think about you running for president?
He was excited. He came to this country from Malta, this tiny nation. Someone placed Buttigieg as a common name. And he came here for the educational opportunities that this country offered, and then he became an American citizen after that. He believed in education. He believed in this country, but he also was very passionate about all the ways it was falling short. And so I don't think he ever guessed that I'd be doing this. Frankly, we didn't either until about a year ago. But when I was getting ready to make the announcement, he was already in pretty rough shape. He was intubated at that point. And I wasn't sure about whether to go, but I knew he wanted it to happen. And so I said, I hope I'll make you proud. And he mouthed around the tube, "You will." And I think we are. I'd like to think we are.
I'm sure you're making him proud.
Pete Buttigieg was the third candidate that was featured at the town hall. The first candidate, John Delaney, was someone for whom I had submitted a question online. This was before I left Denver, and I saw that this town hall was going to be held there. They said, submit questions for the audience. Maybe you'll be picked. And I got a call here at Peter's house the night before the town hall from a producer at CNN saying, "We have chosen your question, and we'd like you to ask it at the town hall of former Congressman Delaney." This is pretty cool. So I got there at the appointed time, and there was a seat with my name on it and a kind of a producer floor person who explained how this was going to work. They gave me a printed out copy of the question that I had submitted. Quite a lot of care went into this. If you watch these town halls, I had to sign a statement saying, yes, this was in fact the question that I had submitted, and they're sort of protecting themselves against anybody that might suspect that there are questions that are planted. But yes, it was my question. And when the time came for me to leave my seat and ask my question, the producer came and tapped me, and she had shown me there was a kind of a cross mark in tape on the floor, and I went to stand there as the person on the left side of the stage, as you face the stage, was finishing up their question. So I'm standing there, and the light's on, and I've got my little piece of paper, and I want to make sure that I get it right, and then the next thing I know, this is what I hear.
I want to bring in Len Edgerly from Denver, Colorado. He's a retired natural gas executive. Len.
Hi, Congressman.
Hey, Len.
You have been visiting with Iowa voters for a year now, and I wonder what advantage do you think that will give you now that many others are entering the race?
So I guess I didn't clear the field is what you're saying. So listen, I think it's a huge advantage, right? Because I've had an opportunity to listen to people, right? Not only have I had an opportunity to introduce myself to folks, but I've really had an opportunity to listen to people.
So that was my moment on CNN, went out live all over the world. One other thing that showed the precision of this event was, as my question was approaching, I thought, at least a 50-50 chance that Jake Tapper is going to be talking about Len Edgerly. That's a common mispronunciation of my name. But Katie, the woman that was kind of my handler, came up to me about 5 minutes before my question came due. She said, "How do you pronounce your name?" And she had an earpiece, and I guess at some point before Jake was calling my name, she had explained to him that I said it's Edgerly, soft G, Edgerly, and that's how he pronounced it. If you've listened to the show for a few years, I think you'll remember probably 2 or 3 years ago, virtual reality or VR made a big splash, and I remember that there was a VR gallery probably at the Marriott. No, it was at the Hilton at that time before the Marriott was built. And you could go in, and at that time there were maybe 5 or 6 booths, and you could put on the VR headsets. They were the old clunky ones that had to have a smartphone in it, and you could watch a VR movie. And I watched one, and it was pretty cool. Well, now, 2-3 years down the road of VR, there was a much larger area. Maybe there were 20 different booths of people that were showing VR productions. And I had some extra time before my supper with Brian Person, so I picked a line that wasn't too long. It said BBC. I thought, well, this has got to be quality. And it was. It was a 6-minute production set in World War I. It was animated, but the animation was very lifelike. It was a realistic animation that was on the topic of field postcards. And these were postcards which soldiers in World War I could send to home in Britain, simply indicating that they were alive. They couldn't put any messages on there, but when one of these postcards would arrive at someone's home, I'm sure it would bring great joy to know that as of the time it was sent, the loved one was alive. Well, in this experience, you find yourself, once you're settled in with a headset and you've got the headphones and all, you're in a trench. And if you look up with your head, you see barbed wire, and it's a very eerie feeling to imagine what it was like in those trenches. I've heard about trench warfare in World War I, but I've never actually been in anything that was a reproduction of one. And with the VR, that's exactly where you are. The other scene is in a home. It looks like a middle-class home in England, and it's a hallway, and these field postcards are sort of flying toward you, and you're getting the feeling of how many of these were sent from the front to the homes. And at one point, a postman brings one of the cards and is kind of handing it to you. The trust aspect of it, I think, is a dimension of VR, and I've heard people in the past say it's an empathy machine, so that when you're plopped down in the middle of a scene, and especially if it's a filmed scene, so that you're actually seeing real people around you as opposed to animation, it's eerie because you have so much more empathy for the people in whatever the scene is happening. In this animated one, the trust had to do with being located in the physical environment. I think another way that you could use Neil's test for how to increase trust was the simplicity of it, that it was a finite number of impressions or information about World War I. There's so many ways that you could portray World War I. This is about one simple thing, field postcards, and it's all about that. So it's a finite image of an infinite tragedy and catastrophe in human history. after I saw the experience on my headset, as I was leaving, somebody mentioned that the producer, or a producer, I guess, was there able to talk. So I talked to her briefly, and here's some excerpts of what she had to say.
My name is Rebecca Collis, and I'm a producer for a company called 59 Productions, based in London. So we have created a VR project based on the Oculus Go. It's called Nothing to Be Written. It's an amazing experience. It's based on World War I and communication efforts that were made during World War I. It's based on a field postcard, it's called. It was a way of quick communication in World War I between soldiers on the front line and people back home. And because it was multiple choice, there was no need for censorship on the postcard, so that it used to be able to be sent very, very quickly. If anything was written on the postcard other than the multiple choice options, it would just be destroyed. So soldiers used to use it so that they could communicate very quickly back home to tell their families and their loved ones that they were still alive. It just meant that it was a quicker way of doing it.
And could the families send the other way? Or was it all just one way from the soldiers?
Families didn't send the postcards back, no. They could send letters and parcels back, but again, it had to go through the censorship process, so it was a bit slower. But it was just one way from the soldiers to the people at home to tell them they were still alive, really.
Well, we're getting close to the end of my consideration of trust at South by Southwest. As I was going to the conference, I was also spending some time with my cousin Peter, because he has decided that it's a good time for him to move into a community of people. He's been living on his own here in Austin. He's blind, and he does an amazing job living independently. But, it's I think there's some loneliness to it. It's a challenging way to live for anyone as they get into their advanced years. He's a couple of years older than I am. I'm going to be 71 this year. So we visited a couple of places, and there's some trust here in this part of the story as well that didn't have to do with South by Southwest, but it got me thinking about it. And we had an unusual experience because we went to one place and we both liked it. The folks were friendly, and it was a pleasant space in the unit that he was looking at. It didn't have such good walking capabilities, and that's really important to him. So we then went to a related facility that's actually run by the same company, and we each had the same sense that it was a heavier environment. It was just didn't have the informality, the life, the spontaneity of the first one. And this is all being picked up by our senses, because we're being toured around, and we had a lunch, and the marketing people were fantastic. They were answering all our questions and giving us all the information. But as this is going on, there's this other channel of sensory information in which we're both reading the character or the feng shui or the ambiance of the place. And when we had a chance to compare notes together with each other, we both said, boy, there's something heavy about this place. And I was fascinated because I could see there was sort of heavy furniture in the lobby. It looked kind of like a big old hotel as opposed to a community. And I was picking this up mainly through visual clues. Peter was getting the exact same information about this place. He has an incredible sense of sound, and maybe some of the aroma or whatever, but mainly in sound. And we marveled that we had both come up with the same assessment on base kind of our six senses, actually our shared actual senses, even though we were getting such different information coming in, because he's blind and I'm not. I think you can trust that, and when you are picking up information on channels other than the facts and figures, how much is the unit going to cost, what's the square footage, all of this information was coming to us, but we were both picking up some pretty accurate information that we could trust on the other dimension. The other trust part of that story is when we went back to the first place, the woman, Debbie Holly, a wonderful marketing person at the first place. Peter had mentioned that he loves to cook, and he does. He loves to grill steak, and when we're together, we have have some great meals because it's a little scary for me to watch him out there with his hands over the grill to touch the steaks, and the flames are flying up, and he's assessing how well done the steaks are by his hands. But he does love to cook. Well, when we got back, Debbie Holly, the marketing person, had a bag for him, and it was kind of a gift bag with tissue paper in it. She somehow, while we were gone for a couple of hours, had located a 2-volume Betty Crocker cookbook in Braille. And I was really touched by that. I thought, she's doing her job. She hopes that Peter will move into the community. But what a thoughtful thing to do, and what a tangible thing that she did. That it helped. I think it helped us both trust her as someone that would be good to deal with, and it helped us to get a feeling for the character of this community. And if all goes well on the rest of my trip here, I think that the next time I come visit Peter at South by Southwest, he's going to be in this great community, and one of the rooms will have a guest bed in it, so I'll have another place to stay next year. Next week, I will be back in Denver. I fly back on Monday, and I've got some interviews that are sort of bunched up together, but they're going to be available for you to hear during the next 3 weeks. Austin Kleon has a new book out. He's a big star of past South by Southwest. This one's titled Keep Going, 10 Ways to Stay Creative in Good Times and Bad. I will also be talking with Michael J. Sullivan, who writes fantasy novels, a very successful self-published novelist, and then Carl Needham, who is the founder of IMDb, the movie database that was acquired by Amazon. So sometimes I'm scrambling early in the week to find interviews, so it's going to be nice to have interviews signed up for the next few weeks. I think I've got to do 2 or 3 of these interviews all next week, so I'm going to be doing some preparation in a scramble when I get back to Denver. It's going to be good to be back. I've been gone 10 days and been staying in touch with Darlene with the Echo Show. I took the little Echo spot with me, so I've got it at my bedside table and can drop in on Darlene with the Echo Show on my desk. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little unusual tour of South by Southwest through the lens of trust, and I'd like to conclude with the stirring conclusion of Neil Pasricha's talk in Ballroom D. I feel so grateful to be able to come to South by Southwest each year, and kind of a veteran at this point. And I hope you've enjoyed this version of it, and I look forward to returning next year.
The final choice, the final question, which is, what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in this low-trust world that we're in right now, where all we're trying to do is sign each other up for our email lists? Where we're walking billboards, we see attention spans, we see eyeballs, we see brains, we see monetizing everything. I saw a billboard just down the street this morning. It's like, this is how these companies see you, and it's the human figure as dollar signs. It's like, is that the world we want to live in, this vague, endless, infinite, algorithmic world of low trust? Or do we want to add back some human connection? Do we want to stand up for what we believe in and tell people that clearly? Do we want to go all in on that? Do we want to have finite offerings? Be clear about what we're passionate about. Let our passions lead us and put them out there. And do we want to live in a world with more compassion and more empathy and a lot more trust? I hope you would join me in saying yes. Thank you so much for your time today.